Hey everybody, this is a section from Baruch Knei-Paz's The Social and Political Thought of Leon Trotsky. This section is titled Literature and Society. Throughout his life, Trotsky wrote profusely about literature. Almost the earliest of Trotsky's writings deal with literary subjects. During his first banishment to Siberia from 1900 to 1902, he contributed regularly to the Irkutsk newspaper Vostochnoye, Obozreny, Eastern Review, and his articles almost invariably discussed works of contemporary literature. Footnote: these articles were later republished in Volume 20 of Trotsky's Sochnenia, the source for subsequent references to them. End footnote. Between 1908 and 1914, during the period marked by the temporary decline of the revolutionary movement in Russia and Trotsky's own isolation from revolutionary activity, Trotsky frequently wrote about literary themes. Footnote: His writings on literary subjects during this period are collected in his Literature and Revolution, 1923 edition. End footnote. After 1917, Trotsky took an active part in the party discussions concerning literature, and Trotsky's book, Literature and Revolution, besides defining the role of the party and government in artistic matters, was also a broad critical survey of the main literary currents of the time. Footnote: parts of this book were discussed in Chapter 7 above. Its more purely literary views will be discussed presently. End footnote. Finally, in the 1930s, Trotsky renewed his interest in the novel and wrote numerous essays on contemporary works of fiction. Footnote: Trotsky's diary in exile also contains many entries in which he commented on the novels, particularly French ones, which he was then, in 1935, reading. All references to the diary are, as previously, to the London 1959 edition. End footnote. Quote, politics and literature, end quote. Trotsky stated in 1935, quote, constitute in essence the content of my personal life, end quote. Trotsky. Diary in exile. Footnote: Trotsky also took an interest in painting and wrote some articles about art exhibitions he visited in Vienna before World War I. But, as Trotsky himself admitted in his autobiography, his knowledge about painting, quote, never went beyond the stage of pure dilettantism, end quote. As for music, about which Trotsky wrote nothing at all, Trotsky remarked elsewhere that, quote, for the most part, end quote, he listened to music, quote, superficially while working, end quote. End footnote. It was not altogether an exaggeration. Trotsky did not, however, write pure literary criticism, and it would be senseless to berate Trotsky for not writing pure literary criticism. Those of Trotsky's critics who have taken Trotsky to task for, among other things, mixing social with literary criticism, and subsuming the whole under political commentary, have surely missed the point. Trotsky could appreciate literature on literature's own terms, but Trotsky wrote about literature as a social critic, and, as such, Trotsky was primarily interested in literature for the light literature threw on social phenomena, as well as for the reflection of such phenomena within it. Footnote: among his critics were T.S. Eliot and F.R. Leavis. For a more generous appreciation of Trotsky's literary criticism, see Edmund Wilson, The Triple Thinkers. See Edmund Wilson, The Triple Thinkers. Georg Lukács, however, in his article Propaganda or Partisanship, published in Partisan Review in 1934, for no reason easily comprehensible, unless it was his well-known endeavor at the time to serve Stalin, denounced Trotsky for supposedly distinguishing between, quote, pure art in the socialist future and propagandist art during the transition to socialism. I'll look up this Edmund Wilson book. The description for Triple Thinkers, 12 Essays on Literary Subjects by Edmund Wilson says, The Triple Thinkers, 12 Essays on Literary Subjects contains some of Edmund Wilson's most significant and brilliant writings on topics and authors ranging from Pushkin, A.E. Housman, Flaubert, Henry James, Marxism, poetry, and more. Okay, that's it. Back to the text and footnote. Trotsky did not, on the whole, pretend to do much more than probe these dimensions of literature. The earliest of Trotsky's writings on literary subjects show how ingrained was this concern with and fascination for the social content of literature. From the outset, Trotsky rejected the view that literature, or art in general, could be divorced from society, or that it could pursue no end beyond itself. Trotsky readily admitted that the means of literature could be non-empirical and non-realistic. In fact, symbols and images were characteristic of literary expression, but these means were used to evoke a social reality, not only an aesthetic reality, even if they were themselves not part of an empirical reality. To turn the means into an end in itself was to sever literature from human life and leave it suspended in a vacuum. The value of a writer's work thus depended, in Trotsky's view, on two separate, though interacting elements. The writer's art itself, that is, the writer's talent for words, description, the evocation of images, and so on, and the writer's social conscience, that is, the writer's concern for the condition of man. It is not surprising, therefore, that already in his early essays on literature, Trotsky took a dim view of the, quote, modernist trends, particularly symbolism, which had begun to appear in Russian writing during the 1890s. Footnote. For Trotsky's first critique of symbolism, along the lines of literary, quote, means and, quote, ends, described above, see Trotsky's essay, O Balmont, referred to in the previous note. For an account of the, quote, modernist trends in Russian literature, first symbolism and later esmaism and futurism, see Elizabeth Stenbach-Firmer. Russian Literature from 1890 to 1917 in Katkov et al.'s edited volume, Russia Enters the 20th Century. And Mark Slonim, From Chekhov to the Revolution, Russian Literature 1900 to 1917. Okay, I'm not seeing anything for the first book. Yeah, I'm not seeing anything for this book, for either of those books. Back to the text and footnote. It is not surprising, therefore, that already in his early essays on literature, Trotsky took a dim view of the, quote, modernist trends, particularly symbolism, which had begun to appear in Russian writing early in the 1890s. Trotsky's preference was quite clearly for those writers for whom, Trotsky believed, literature was virtually a confrontation with social reality and a weapon for transforming social reality. Thus, for example, Trotsky was deeply moved by the work and person of the populist Gleb Uspensky. Uspensky's life, Trotsky wrote, had ended tragically. Uspensky died insane in 1902 as a direct consequence of Gleb Uspensky's struggle against the, quote, ugliness of the present. Yet, in his work, he had retained faith in the future, and everything that he wrote shone with the spirit of the true revolutionary, rejecting the past and present, searching for a new identity. Similarly, Trotsky admired the critic Dobrolyubov for emphasizing the relation between literature and social and political progress. For Dobrolyubov's disdain for cheap platitudes and Dobrolyubov's satire upon those who avoided the burning problems of the day by filling their heads with, quote, petty matters, end quote. Footnote. Dobrolyubov was a leader of the critical school which advocated the principle of social utilitarianism in judging the value of a literary work, i.e. the merit of the work was to depend not only on its artistic qualities, but the extent as well to which it served the cause of progress. End footnote. Trotsky's esteem for literature that did not recoil from direct social observation and comment extended also to non-Russian works. The plays of Ibsen, for instance, An Enemy of the People, in which Trotsky saw the dramatist exposing the subtle but crushing ways in which, quote, bourgeois society destroyed bourgeois society's nonconformists, had an obvious appeal for Trotsky, even if Trotsky simultaneously denounced Ibsen's elitism, Ibsen's fear of the, quote, people, and disdain for mass democracy. Alright, so that paragraph had a lot of people to look up. The first is Gleb Uspensky. It just says Gleb Uspensky lived from 1843 to 1902 and was a Russian writer and a prominent figure of the Narodnik movement. Nikolai Dobrolyubov lived from 1836 to 1861. Nikolai Dobrolyubov was a Russian poet, literary critic, journalist, and prominent figure of the Russian revolutionary movement. Nikolai Dobrolyubov was a literary hero to both Karl Marx and Lenin. And finally, An Enemy of the People by Ibsen. An Enemy of the People is an 1882 play by Norwegian playwright Henrik Ibsen that delves into the conflict between personal integrity and societal norms. The play centers on Dr. Thomas Stockman, who discovers a serious contamination issue in his town's new spas, endangering public health. Thomas Stockman's courageous decision to expose this truth brings severe backlash from local leaders, including Thomas Stockman's brother, Peter Stockman, who is a powerful political figure in the town. Set against the backdrop of a community grappling with economic and environmental concerns, An Enemy of the People highlights the often harsh consequences faced by those who challenge established systems. Ibsen's depiction of this struggle emphasizes the tension between truth and expediency. The character of Peter Stockman is based on Ibsen's own uncle, Christian Cornelius Paus, whose political influence and authoritative role in Ibsen's hometown of Skien parallel those of Peter Stockman in the play. Ibsen himself was uncertain about the play's classification, noting in a letter to Ibsen's publisher that the play contained both comedic and serious elements, reflecting his complex view of the protagonist's moral stance. This exploration of moral and societal conflict follows Ibsen's earlier work, Ghosts, which faced similar criticism for Ghost's bold critique of societal norms. Okay, back to the text. Trotsky's preparedness, however, to appreciate a writer's literary talent and powers of social observation without regard for the same writer's political views or underlying ideology, a preparedness which was to mark Trotsky off from the shrill and narrow attitudes of some of his co-revolutionists of 1917, come out particularly vivid in an essay he devoted to Gogol in 1802 on the 50th anniversary of Gogol's death. Nikolai Gogol lived from 1809 to 1852. Nikolai Gogol was a Russian novelist, short story writer, and playwright of Ukrainian origin. Gogol used the grotesque in his writings, for example, in his works The Nose, Vi, The Overcoat, and Nevsky Prospect. These stories and others, such as Diary of a Madman, have also been noted for their proto-surrealist qualities. According to Viktor Shklovsky, Gogol used the technique of defamiliarization when a writer presents common things in an unfamiliar or strange way so that the reader can gain new perspectives and see the world differently. Gogol's early works, such as Evenings on a Farm near Dikanka, were influenced by his Ukrainian upbringing, Ukrainian culture, and folklore. His latter writing satirized political corruption in contemporary Russia, The Government Inspector, Dead Souls. Although Gogol also enjoyed the patronage of Tsar Nicholas I, who liked Gogol's work. The novel Taras Bulba of 1835, the play Marriage of 1842, and the short stories The Tale of How Ivan Ivanovich Quarreled with Ivan Nikiforovich, The Portrait, and The Carriage are also among Gogol's best-known works. Many writers and critics have recognized Nikolai Gogol's huge influence on Russian, Ukrainian, and world literature. Gogol's influence was acknowledged by Fyodor Dostoevsky, Mikhail Saltykov, Shchedrin, Ryunosuke Akutagawa, Franz Kafka, Mikhail Bulgakov, Vladimir Nabokov, Flannery O'Connor, and others. Eugene Michois de Vouguet said, quote, "We all came out from under Gogol's overcoat." Back to the text. Footnote. Actually, no footnote. Here, too, Trotsky's partiality for realistic fiction is only too apparent, as is Trotsky's distaste for what Trotsky called Gogol's later, quote, didactic mysticism and, quote, ascetic moralism. Gogol's lack of coherent social critique going beyond the, quote, strictures of civic decency, far beyond such rules as those forbidding us to take bribes and rob public funds, end quote. Trotsky. Yet the essay is in fact a defense of Gogol against his detractors, against those who, because they cannot stomach Gogol's social conclusions, allow this to color their appreciation of Gogol's literary talents. Quote, before Gogol's appearance, end quote, Trotsky declared, quote, Russian literature merely tried to exist. After Gogol, Russian literature exists, end quote. Trotsky paid tribute to Gogol as the, quote, father of Russian comedy and the Russian novel, end quote. The first, quote, truly national writer, ... freed of the impulse towards imitation, end quote, of European literature and, in this sense, a forerunner of Goncharov, Tolstoy, and Dostoevsky. Wikipedia says Ivan Goncharov lived from 1812 to 1891 and was a Russian novelist best known for his novels The Same Old Story, published in 1847, also translated as A Common Story, Oblomov, 1859, and The Precipice, 1869, also translated as Malinovka Heights. Ivan Goncharov also served in many official capacities, including the position of censor. Goncharov was born in Simbirsk to the family of a wealthy merchant. As a reward for his grandfather's military service, they are elevated to Russian nobility status. Goncharov was educated at a boarding school, then the Moscow College of Commerce, and finally at Moscow State University. After graduating, Goncharov served for a short time in the office of the governor of Simbirsk before moving to St. Petersburg, where he worked as government translator and private tutor while publishing poetry and fiction in private almanacs. Goncharov's first novel, The Same Old Story, was published in Sovremennik in 1847. Goncharov's second and best-known novel, Oblomov, was published in 1859 in Otechestvenia Zabisky. Ivan Goncharov's third and final novel, The Precipice, was published in Vestnik Evropy in 1869. Ivan Goncharov also worked as a literary and theater critic. Toward the end of his life, Ivan Goncharov wrote a memoir called An Uncommon Story, in which Ivan Goncharov accused his literary rivals, first and foremost Ivan Turgenev, of having plagiarized his works and prevented Ivan Goncharov from achieving European fame. An Uncommon Story was published in 1924. Fyodor Dostoevsky, among others, considered Ivan Goncharov an author of high stature. Anton Chekhov is quoted as stating that Goncharov was, quote, ... 10 heads above me in talent, end quote. Back to the text. The ultimate source of Gogol's greatness was, of course, Gogol's individual genius, but it also derived, in Trotsky's view, from the fact that Gogol was the first to see the connection between literature and life. Quote, before Gogol, ... our life and the convictions aroused by our life went one way, our poetry another. The link between the writer and the man was feeble. The most vital men, when they took up their pens to write, concerned themselves mainly with theories of taste and not with the meaning of their work. ... Letters were dissociated from life. Literature created literature's works from literature's self, in obedience to the laws of poetry. But Gogol, in Gogol's fiction, ... put an end to this stifling autonomy. End quote. Trotsky. The result of this new, quote, linkage between life and literature, according to Trotsky, was the birth of the Russian novel, where social reality could be portrayed as in no other literary form. Referring to Gogol's main work, Dead Souls, published in 1842, Trotsky summarized Gogol's accomplishment. Quote, by the power of his artistic intuition, Gogol stormed the fortress of barbarism, daily brutality, common crime, and invincible meanness, infinite Russian meanness. Gogol took everything accumulated by history, consolidated by custom, covered by the dust of centuries, and crowned by mystical sanction, and proceeded to shake it, lift it, lay it bare, and make it into a problem for our thought, a question for our conscience. All this Gogol did without the aid of systematic reason. Gogol's creative genius came to grips with reality through the use, so to speak, of its bare hands. End quote. Trotsky. Wikipedia says Dead Souls is a novel by Nikolai Gogol, first published in 1842 and widely regarded as an exemplar of 19th century Russian literature. The novel chronicles the travels and adventures of Pavel Ivanovich Chichikov and the people whom Pavel Ivanovich Chichikov encounters. These people typify the Russian middle aristocracy of the time. Nikolai Gogol himself saw Dead Souls as a, quote, epic poem in prose, end quote, and within the book characterized it as a, quote, poem in prose, end quote. Nikolai Gogol intended the novel to be the first part of a 3-volume work, but burned the manuscript of the second part shortly before his death. Although Dead Souls ends in mid-sentence, like Sterna's Sentimental Journey, Dead Souls is regarded by some as complete in the extant form. Back to the text. After attempting to explain why Gogol later turned into a, quote, didactic mystic, end quote, Trotsky gave as the main reasons, firstly, the fact that during Gogol's time, there was as yet no, quote, coherent intellectual atmosphere, end quote, no leading, quote, political ideology, ... accessible to literature, end quote, and secondly, the limitation of Gogol's, quote, inherited moral codes, end quote, Gogol's, quote, traditional upbringing, end quote. Trotsky declared that Gogol's creative work nevertheless, quote, produced in the public conscience a coherent body of thought that went beyond the limitations of Gogol's own social outlook, end quote. Trotsky. Footnote. In denouncing Gogol's, quote, mysticism and, quote, moralism, Trotsky referred in particular to Gogol's 1847 work, Selected Passages from Correspondence with Friends. Although Gogol had always been a conservative in his social and political views, it was in this work that Gogol was most openly appeared as a supporter of the autocracy and the Orthodox Church, as an adherent of religious mysticism, and as a defender of serfdom. End footnote. By showing the contradiction between the, quote, rigid forms of Russian life and Russian life's fluid content, end quote, Gogol's work, particularly Dead Souls, contrasted reality with an ideal, quote, that which is, end quote, with that, quote, which should be, end quote. Footnote. Here, as elsewhere throughout this essay, Trotsky quoted from V.G. Belinsky, the influential Russian literary critic who is a contemporary of Gogol's, on Gogol's work. In fact, the essay is partly an appreciation of Belinsky himself, whom Trotsky venerated as the, quote, intellectual godfather, end quote, of the social consciousness of Russian literature, which first emerged with Gogol. Belinsky, who believed that the writer must serve the cause of social and political change and describe the world realistically or naturalistically, and who was an extreme opponent of religion and of the Orthodox Church, had been an early admirer of Gogol's work. However, in 1847, when Gogol selected passages from Correspondence with Friends appeared, Belinsky wrote his famous Letter to Gogol, which denounced, in the most intense language, Gogol's religiosity, acceptance of Russian institutions, and, in Belinsky's view, betrayal of vocation. For an account of Belinsky, and in general for a fascinating survey of intellectual and literary life in Russia during the years 1838 to 48, see Isaiah Berlin's The Marvelous Decade, published in Encounter, December 1955. End footnote. Thus, Gogol's sometimes, quote, narrow-minded and quietistic homilies, end quote, notwithstanding, Gogol's contribution to literature and social consciousness was enormous. Trotsky concluded his essay on Gogol thus, quote, if he tried to weaken the social meaning of his own books by the explanations Gogol provided for his own books, let this not be held against Gogol. If in Gogol's publicistic work Gogol seduced some petty-minded creature, let Gogol be forgiven, and for his great artistic merits, for the elevating and human influence of his work, eternal and undying glory to Gogol, end quote. Trotsky. Trotsky's first essays on literary subjects were written at a time when Trotsky was only in his early 20s. But Trotsky's taste in, as well as approach to, literature, though they became more refined in the course of time, did not change in any fundamental way. Political subjects and events occupied Trotsky after 1902, but Trotsky resumed writing about literature in 1908, and from 1908 until 1914, Trotsky composed numerous essays on literary topics. The most interesting of these, which showed Trotsky to be preoccupied by the same themes as in 1901 to 1902, the two essays on Tolstoy, the one written in 1908 on the occasion of Tolstoy's 80th birthday, the other in 1910 on Tolstoy's death. The first of these contains an almost panegyrical tribute to Tolstoy's talent for evoking character, atmosphere, panorama, and for binding the whole together in a seemingly effortless style. Quote, "What a miracle of reincarnation is a genius capable of," end quote. Trotsky. Predictably, however, both essays concentrate on the social aspects of Tolstoy, the man, and Tolstoy, the writer. Trotsky was hardly able to control Trotsky's disdain for Tolstoy's moral philosophy, the flight as Trotsky saw it from reality, from society, from history even, into nature, religion, and the, quote, abstract commandments of love, of temperance, and of passive resistance, end quote. Trotsky. Why is it, Trotsky wondered, that Tolstoy, though still living and whose writing remains so captivating, nevertheless already appeared to be a figure from a, quote, different historical world, end quote, and claimed to find the answer in the fact that in the, quote, deepest and most secret recesses of his creativeness, end quote, and, quote, despite all Tolstoy's ... spiritual crises, end quote, Tolstoy had remained a, quote, aristocrat. By this, Trotsky meant nothing so crude as the fact of Tolstoy's birth and upbringing, but rather Tolstoy's mentality, Tolstoy's psychology, which was incapable of abiding the turmoil, the dislocation, the pace, and the depersonalization of the modern world, above all the material and scientific changes the modern world had introduced. Tolstoy's was a psychology rooted in simplicity, in gentility, in changelessness, in the, quote, eternal cycle of birth, love, and death, end quote. Tolstoy had revolted against the nobility, against Tolstoy's own background, against serfdom, against all forms of oppression of man over man, but his distaste for change, progress, the emerging environment of city, commerce, and industry resulted in a virtual withdrawal from the world altogether. And this was reflected in his literature where only the, quote, landlord and music, especially the landlord, were given, quote, creative sanctuary, end quote. Without directly identifying himself with this world of Russia's seemingly infinite past, Tolstoy was able to populate Tolstoy's works only with aristocrats and peasants, so intimately interwoven in Russia's history, and both representing for Tolstoy that quality of changelessness and continuity which was at the root of Tolstoy's soul's yearning. Quote, Tolstoy's whole heart was fixed there where life is reproduced changelessly from one generation to the next, century after century. There where sacred necessity rules over everything, where every single step hinges on the sun, the rain, the wind, and the green grass growing, where nothing comes from one's own reason or from an individual's rebellious volition, and therefore where no personal responsibility exists either. Everything is predetermined, everything justified in advance, sanctified ... And this perpetual hearing and obeying, converted into perpetual toil, is precisely what shapes the life which outwardly leads to no results whatever, but which has its result in its very self, end quote. Trotsky. As for the new world, new social relations, new social figures, the merchant, the intellectual, the factory worker, these rarely appeared in Tolstoy's works, and when the merchant, the intellectual, the factory worker did appear in Tolstoy's works, the merchant, the intellectual, the factory worker passed, quote, before his artist's eye like so many insignificant and largely comical silhouettes, end quote. Trotsky. Reality was being transformed, but, quote, psychologically, Tolstoy turned his back on this immense process and forever refused its artistic recognition, end quote. Trotsky. The first of Trotsky's two essays on Tolstoy ended with a final homage to the genius of the artist and to the moral courage of the man who, compromising with no earthly with no earthly power, insisted on going his own, quote, solitary way. The second essay was meant as an ironic comment on the effect of Tolstoy's ideas. Rather than turning men away from politics and earthly concerns, they had contributed to that climate of dissatisfaction and revolt which turned Russia into an arena for revolutionary struggle. Quote, although not a revolutionary, Tolstoy nurtured the revolutionary element which his words of genius, ... And in this sense one might say that everything in Tolstoy's social teaching that is lasting and permanent flows into socialism as naturally as a river flows into the ocean, end quote. Trotsky. This last was so transparently facile an attempt by Trotsky to, quote, adopt or, quote, mobilize Tolstoy for revolutionary socialism that it is difficult to believe that Trotsky did not write it with tongue-in-cheek. Yet it symbolizes both the scope and limits of Trotsky's general approach to literature, particularly as this was to be expressed in his 1923 book, Literature and Revolution. Footnote. As between 1903 and 1908, so between 1914 and 1923, Trotsky wrote almost nothing on literary topics, but as the work to be presently discussed shows, Trotsky did not stop reading literature during this period. End footnote. On the one hand, it was an approach governed by a liberal attitude and principle to all literature, an openness to the artistic merits of a creative work without regard for that creative work's or the author's political views. On the other hand, however, Trotsky could not free himself of the need to ask the utilitarian question: what is the worth of the work from the point of view of one's social and political interests and goals? There was in him, therefore, a tension between the respecter of literature and the committed revolutionary. The committed revolutionary, however, tempered by the respecter of literature, could work as much to the, quote, advantage of an ideologically suspect writer as against him, as the attempt quoted above to, quote, legitimize Tolstoy shows. This is amply evident in Literature and Revolution, written at a time when Trotsky was not only a revolutionary, but a revolutionary in power. Footnote. Parts of this work dealing with the question of a, quote, proletarian literature were discussed in Chapter 7 above. Here the earlier sections devoted to a critique of contemporary or, quote, modernist trends in literature will be considered. All references as previously are to the Moscow 1923 edition. End footnote. Consider, for example, Trotsky's views on three, quote, modernist schools of the time: symbolism, formalism, and futurism. Wikipedia says Russian symbolism was an intellectual, literary, and artistic movement predominant at the end of the 19th and beginning of the 20th century. It arose separately from West European symbolism and emphasized defamiliarization and the mysticism of sophiology. Wikipedia says Russian formalism was a school of literary theory in Russia from the 1910s to the 1930s. Russian formalism includes the work of a number of highly influential Russian and Soviet scholars such as Viktor Shklovsky, Yuri Tynyanov, Vladimir Prop, Boris Eichenbaum, Roman Jacobson, Boris Tomaszewski, Grigory Glukovsky, who revolutionized literary criticism between 1914 and the 1930s by establishing the specificity and autonomy of poetic language and literature, Russian formalism exerted a major influence on thinkers like Mikhail Bakhtin and Yuri Lotman, and on structuralism as a whole. The movement's members had a relevant influence on modern literary criticism as it developed in the structuralist and post-structuralist periods. Under Stalin, it became a pejorative term for elitist art. Russian formalism was a diverse movement, producing no unified doctrine and no consensus amongst its proponents on a central aim of their endeavors. In fact, Russian formalism describes two distinct movements: the OPOJAZ, Society for the Study of Poetic Language in St. Petersburg, and the Moscow Linguistic Circle. Therefore, it is more precise to refer to the, quote, Russian formalist, rather than to use the more encompassing and abstract term of formalism. The term, quote, formalism was first used by the adversaries of the movement, and as such it conveys a meaning explicitly rejected by the formalists themselves. In the words of one of the foremost formalists, Boris Eichenbaum, quote, it is difficult to recall who coined this name, but it was not a very felicitous coinage. It might have been convenient as a simplified battle cry, but it fails, as an objective term, to delimit the activities of the, quote, Society for the Study of Poetic Language, end quote. Russian formalism is the name now given to a mode of criticism which emerged from two different groups, the Moscow Linguistic Circle, 1915, and the OPOJAZ group, 1916. Although Russian formalism is often linked to American New Criticism because of their similar emphasis on close reading, the Russian formalists regarded themselves as developers of a science of criticism and are more interested in a discovery of systematic method for the analysis of poetic text. And the Wikipedia says, Russian futurism is the broad term for a movement of Russian poets and artists who adopted the principles of Filippo Marinetti's Manifesto of Futurism, which espoused the rejection of the past and a celebration of speed, machinery, violence, youth, industry, destruction of academies, museums, and urbanism. Russian futurism also advocated for modernization and cultural rejuvenation. Russian futurism began roughly in the early 1910s. In 1912, a year after ego-futurism began. The literary group Hylea, also spelled, G-U, it doesn't matter, you can't see the first spelling. Hylea issued the manifesto, a slap in the face of public taste. The 1912 movement was originally called Cubo-futurism, but this term is now used to refer to the style of art produced. Russian futurism ended shortly after the Russian Revolution of 1917, after which former Russian futurists either left the country or participated in the new art movements. Notable Russian futurists include Natalia Goncharova, Mikhail Larionov, David Berliuk, Kazimir Malevich, Vladimir Mayakovsky, and Velimir Klebnikov. Okay, so back to the text. We have already noted that Trotsky always preferred, whether as a matter of taste or ideological disposition, or both, literature which was realistic and socially conscious. Belinsky was his Belinsky was his, quote, mentor on this. Vissarion Belinsky lived from 1811 to 1848 and was a Russian literary critic of westernizing tendency. Belinsky played one of the key roles in the career of poet and publisher Nikolai Nekrasov and his popular magazine Sovremennik. Vissarion Belinsky was the most influential of the westernizers, especially among the younger generation. Vissarion Belinsky worked primarily as a literary critic because that area was less heavily censored than political pamphlets. Vissarion Belinsky agreed that with Slavophiles that society had precedence over individualism, but Vissarion Belinsky insisted the society had to allow the expression of individual ideas and rights. Vissarion Belinsky strongly opposed Slavophiles on the role of orthodoxy, which Belinsky considered a retrograde force. Vissarion Belinsky emphasized reason and knowledge and attacked autocracy and theocracy. Back to the text. Footnote. Symbolist school had in fact become a spent force long before 1923, giving way to the school of Acmeism, whose best-known members were Osip Mandelstam and Anna Akhmatova. See Stenbach-Fermer. As for formalism, it was, of course, primarily a school of literary criticism, not of imaginative literature itself. End footnote. Trotsky's attitude towards symbolism was that symbolism was in essence an attempt to escape human experience by using forms as far removed from any recognizable reality as possible. In Literature and Revolution, Trotsky wrote that such an escape was in any case hopeless. The symbolists, alienated from their environment, the ugly, stifling culture of old Russia, merely gave expression to this alienation by so obsessively avoiding contact with reality. Ironically, therefore, they came to reflect a very specific situation, the particularity of their environment, belonging to a definite but limited historical period. Unable to transcend its environment, because it was, so to speak, nurtured by it, symbolism could not outlive its time or its authors. Unable to transcend its environment because it was, so to speak, nurtured by its environment, symbolism could not outlive its time or its authors. Alexander Blok, who was together with Andrei Bely, the best known of the symbolists, in Trotsky's view, eventually recognized this and overcame it. Alexander Blok escaped the confines of Alexander Blok's period and, quote, entered the sphere of October, end quote. When Alexander Blok wrote the poem, quote, The 12, his, quote, most important work and the only one which will live for ages, end quote. Trotsky. Alexander Blok was a Russian lyrical poet, writer, publicist, playwright, translator, and literary critic. Alexander Blok lived from 1880 to 1921. According to Wikipedia, Andrei Bely lived from 1880 to 1934. Andrei Bely was a Russian novelist, symbolist, poet, theorist, and literary critic. Andrei Bely was a committed anthroposophist and follower of Rudolf Steiner. Andrei Bely's novel, Petersburg, was regarded by Vladimir Nabokov as the third greatest masterpiece of modernist literature. The Andrei Bely Prize, one of the most important prizes in Russian literature, was named after Andrei Bely. Andrei Bely's poems were set to music and performed by Russian singer-songwriters. Back to the text. Footnote. Blok wrote the poem at the beginning of 1918. End footnote. Using symbols and images as in the past, but now anchoring himself to the hopes of the present and the vision of a new future, Blok was able to create a work of art inconceivable before 1917, and transcending its immediate surroundings. The 12 was not, to be sure, quote, a poem of the revolution, end quote. The 12 was, Trotsky wrote, quote, the swan song of the individualistic art that went over to the revolution, end quote, but which, born in a different age, having the, quote, psychic needs, end quote, of the 12's origins, could not entirely adapt the 12's self to a new age. Footnote. No footnote. This did not detract from the 12's greatness and the attempt to frown upon the 12 because the 12 used such images as that of Christ was merely a narrow-minded campaign to make literature a direct and immediate reflection of daily events. Footnote. At the beginning of the book, Trotsky wrote, quote, the nightingale of poetry, like that bird of wisdom, the owl, is heard only after the sun is set. The day is a time for action, but at twilight feeling and reason come to take account of what has been accomplished, ... All through history, mind limps after reality, end quote. Trotsky. End footnote. Bloch at least, quote, reached out towards us, end quote. And, quote, the result of his impulse is the most significant work of our epoch, end quote. As for Belly, however, Belly has remained, in Trotsky's view, mired in Belly's mystical individualism, a captive entirely of the past for whom the present hardly exists. Belly's work, therefore, was an expression of Belly's self alone, of Belly's individual problems, though through Belly's self, Belly recalled also the problems, now merely a historical curiosity, of the pre-1917 age. Footnote. These pages are full of the most derogatory comments about Belly's writings. Trotsky also made fun of the fact that Belly was a follower of the German anthroposophist Rudolf Steiner. End footnote. Thus, quote, Belly is a corpse and will not be resurrected in any spirit, end quote. Trotsky. This brief summary of Trotsky's comments on Bloch and Belly serves to point up both the attraction and exasperation which one feels with Trotsky as literary critic. On the one hand, there is a liberal-mindedness in him, a rejection of narrow and petty ideological demands, a refusal to subscribe to some mechanistic Marxist view of art, a readiness to enrich the, quote, revolution through art, which is universal, and a complete acceptance of the principle that art must not be a handmaiden of politics. On the other hand, Trotsky is unable so much as to contemplate the possibility that art was a personal vocation, that art was, perhaps above all, the voice and the feeling of the artist himself, and that therefore art could function outside of collectivist goals, nor can Trotsky see any value whatever in the artist's obsession, to the exclusion of all other concerns, with words in themselves, with their music, rhythm, inner lulls, words independent, and in the eyes of the artist, self-sufficient life. It is a measure of this blindness that Trotsky failed to appreciate the work of so important a figure in Russian literature as Belly. Footnote. For a brief account of Belly's work, which brings out the extent to which Trotsky both misunderstood and was unfair to Belly, Belly also wrote novels which were socially conscious, and in later life his sympathies for the revolution led Belly to seek a union between symbolism and socialism. End footnote. Trotsky's impatience with the formalist school of literary scholarship was no less pronounced, though here perhaps more justifiably, since, unlike a symbolist like Belly, whose interest in words is above all artistic and imaginative, the formalist approach was primarily intellectual and systematizing, as their name indicates. Footnote. For a detailed study of the history and doctrine of the formalist school, see Victor Ehrlich, Russian Formalism. Published, third edition, published 1969. Yeah, there's no detailed description on this.
on Google Books. So I can't look that up. Ehrlich summarizes, with some degree of agreement, Trotsky's strictures against formalism and says that Trotsky's, quote, awareness of the peculiar claims of artistic creativity distinguished Trotsky markedly from the cruder practitioners of Marxist criticism, end quote. Victor Ehrlich. End footnote. Trotsky admitted that the, quote, methods of formalism, confined within legitimate limits, may help to clarify the artistic and psychological peculiarities of literary form, end quote. But to see the essence of poetics in the study of forms and in the descriptive and statistical analysis of syntax, vowels, consonants, and syllables was to raise art merely, quote, to the position of chemistry, end quote. Trotsky. Footnote. However, as Ehrlich points out, it was a misrepresentation or misconception on Trotsky's part to claim that formalists were mainly engaged in, quote, counting words and letters, end footnote. Form in literature was a question of technique and, as such, of utmost importance. It was also important to study forms objectively and not merely in accordance with arbitrary, quote, tastes and moods, end quote. Quote, but the formalists are not content to content to ascribe to the formalist methods a merely subsidiary, serviceable, and technical significance, similar to that which statistics has for social science or the microscope for the biological sciences, end quote. Trotsky. Literature and Revolution. The formalist, quote, science, according to Trotsky, aims at nothing less than a cult, and a soulless cult at that, of the word, and this inevitably leads to the, quote, superstition, end quote, of the word. Trotsky, Literature and Revolution. But literature was not exhausted by literature's forms and mechanics. Literature's content and the circumstances, social or psychological, for literature's development were no less important for understanding literature's character. Trotsky had little difficulty in disposing of one formalist claim for the complete independence of literature from factors extraneous to literature's language. Trotsky agreed with the formalist that Marxism was not necessarily an infallible guide to aesthetic qualities. But Marxism could provide a social explanation for the forms which literature took. It, quote, alone can explain why and how a given tendency in art has originated in a given period of history, end quote. Ah, you bitch. Going. Quote, the architectural scheme of the Cologne Cathedral can be established by measuring the base and the height of its arches, by determining the 3 dimensions of its naves, the dimensions and placement of the columns, etc., without knowing what a medieval city was like, what a guild was, or what was the Catholic Church in the Middle Ages, the Cologne Cathedral will never be understood. The effort to set art free from life, to declare art a craft self-sufficient unto itself, devitalizes and kills art. The very need of such an operation is an unmistakable symptom of intellectual decline, end quote. Trotsky. Footnote. This is a footnote that I missed. One of the leading formalists, Victor Shklovsky, had argued in an essay that Marxism was either mistaken in its interpretation of art or simply irrelevant since, firstly, literary forms seemed to be universal, and secondly, literary themes were not necessarily definable in terms of national or ethnic environment. Though Trotsky devoted some 5 pages to arguing with Shklovsky, Trotsky did admit that the characteristics of, quote, human imagination, end quote, have a partially independent effect on creativity. End footnote. And Trotsky concluded Trotsky's attack on formalism with the following literary, quote, credo. The formalist school represents an abortive idealism applied to the question of art. The formalists show a fast ripening religiousness. They are followers of St. John. They believe that, quote, in the beginning was the word, end quote. But we believe that in the beginning was the deed. The word followed as the deed's phonetic shadow, end quote. Trotsky. Despite his extreme strictures against formalism, Trotsky never suggested, the idea did not so much as occur to Trotsky, that it be eliminated artificially by political decree. Trotsky believed that in the post-1917 social climate, it would naturally wither away. Footnote. In fact, however, when by 1930 it ceased to exist to all intents and purposes, it was the political climate which decreed formalism's extinction. In a subsequent chapter, Ehrlich describes how during the later Zhdanov era, formalism became one of those terms of abuse of the like of, quote, Menshevism, quote, Trotskyism, quote, cosmopolitanism, which the Soviet authorities trundled out whenever the Soviet authorities wished to be done with something or someone. End footnote. Despite Trotsky's extreme strictures against formalism, Trotsky never suggested, the idea did not so much as occur to Trotsky, that formalism be eliminated artificially by political decree. Trotsky believed that in the post-1917 social climate, formalism would naturally wither away. In the field, in any case, of literary creativity itself, of imaginative literature, it was futurism which was the rising movement in Russia and had been since at least 1912. Footnote. This was the year in which Vladimir Mayakovsky, the most brilliant and famous of the futurists, and others published their manifesto, a slap in the face of public taste, rejecting most of Russia's classic writers as obsolescent. End footnote. Indeed, with its emphasis on urbanism, technology, dynamism, and a variety of, quote, futuristic portents, futurism ostensibly at least seemed to be closest in spirit to the vision of 1917. Footnote. Because of this affinity, it was allowed to flourish somewhat longer than other literary movements, and in Mayakovsky, who was an ardent supporter of the revolution and a member of the Bolshevik Party, Mayakovsky's doubts, ending in suicide, came later, at the end of the 1920s. See his play The Bedbug. The Soviet Union produced perhaps its only original and truly great talent, as opposed to other notable writers who never wholly identified with the Soviet regime. For accounts of Russian literature since 1917, see Max Hayward and Leopold Lebed's edited volume Literature and Revolution in Soviet Russia, 1917 to 1962, and Gleb Struve, Russian Literature under Lenin and Stalin, 1917 to 1953. Second, yeah, I'm not seeing anything for that book. The Haywood and Leopold Lebed's book. Yeah, I'm not really seeing any description for Gleb Struve's book either. Anyway, see if there's anything from Mayakovsky, Bedbug. Wikipedia says The Bed Bug is a play written by Vladimir Mayakovsky, written in 1928-29 and published originally by Molodaya Gvardia magazine, numbers 3 and 4, 1929. Then is a book by Gosesdat in 1929. Quote, the fairy comedy in 9 pictures, end quote, lampooning the type of Philistine that emerged with the new economic policy in the Soviet Union, was premiered in February 1929 at the Meyerholt Theater with designs by Alexander Rodchenko. Received warmly by audiences, The Bed Bug caused controversy and received harsh treatment in the Soviet press. Unlike The Bed Bug's follow-up, The Bathhouse, denounced as ideologically deficient, The Bed Bug was criticized mostly for its alleged, quote, aesthetic faults, end quote. Back to the text and footnote. End footnote. Trotsky's view of this movement, futurism, however, was, to say the least, ambivalent. Trotsky appreciated the fact that futurism had directly aligned itself with the revolution, which it was prepared to serve, yet Trotsky attributed this to largely accidental factors rather than to any intrinsic political character which the movement may have had. Trotsky pointed out justly that in Italy the futurist movement had identified itself with Mussolini's fascist regime, and Trotsky hinted that this was more natural than the self-identification of its Russian counterpart with communism. Footnote. When in 1914 Marinetti, the leader of the Italian futurists, visited Russia, Marinetti shocked the Russian futurists by talking of the, quote, glories of war, authority, heroism, capitalism, and virility. The Russians hurried to dissociate themselves from these views and thereafter kept largely to themselves. Following the rise of Mussolini, Marinetti became the head of the Fascist Academy. End footnote. Footnote. See Literature and Revolution, page 93, where Trotsky wrote that the fact that Italian futurism merged with fascism, quote, is entirely in accord with the law of cause and effect, end quote. At the end of his chapter on futurism, Trotsky appended a 1922 letter from the Italian communist Antonio Gramsci concerning the political fate of Italian futurism. The letter reported that most of the futurists had turned to fascism. End footnote. The latter phenomenon was to be explained, in Trotsky's view, by the fact that at the time of October 1917, Russian futurism had been still in its infancy. Russian futurism's views not yet formed, and, having been primarily a movement of nonconformism, Russian futurism had been persecuted by its milieu. The revolution swept the futurists along. The futurists yearned for action and change. The futurists were eager to reject the past. The futurists saw in the revolution the vehicle for all this. Beyond such generalities, however, there was no inherent common ground, according to Trotsky, between the Russian futurists and socialism. Footnote. That a movement was critical of the bourgeoisie, Trotsky wrote, did not itself imply that the movement was not bourgeois in character. Russian futurism was Bohemian in origin, and Bohemianism was a form of bourgeois culture characteristic of certain periods. As for Russian futurism's opposition to the past, Russian futurism's calls for jettisoning the literary tradition, of what relevance, Trotsky wondered, was this to the proletariat which had no part in the literary tradition? Even assuming that Pushkin, for example, had to be rejected, Trotsky in fact thought this ridiculous. Did not the working class, Trotsky asked, first have to master and absorb Pushkin before the working class could overcome Pushkin? End footnote. Still, the issue, Trotsky conceded, was not the nature of Futurism's political affiliation, but the merits of its creative work. Some of its achievements, he believed, were beyond any doubt. It had rejuvenated the vocabulary and syntax of the Russian language. Russian Futurism had discovered and created new rhythms and orchestrations. Moreover, Russian Futurism's experimental attitude, Russian Futurism's refusal to be trampled by old styles, Russian Futurism's opposition to literary conventions, together with its determination to adapt language to the new age of science, machines, speed, and the modern man in general, had made it a living and creative force in literature. But in its eagerness to break down the old barriers, it had allowed itself to be carried away by the pretension that it could simultaneously create a new culture, as if the new culture were simply a matter of the willpower of a few writers. The futurists wished to, quote, anticipate history by giving birth in the present to the art of the future. Art, the Russian futurists said, was, quote, not a mirror but a hammer. Art does not reflect, art shapes, end quote. Thus, they had set themselves up as the begetters of the new art and language of socialism and of the workers. But this, in Trotsky's view, not only ignored the depth of the cultural poverty and therefore the actual limited potential of the masses, it also flew in the face of all that was known about cultural development. Art could prod society on, but art could not run ahead of society, as if it were an independent entity standing outside society. Quote, to tear out of the future that which can only develop as an inseparable part of the future, and to hurriedly materialize this partial anticipation in the present-day dearth and before the cold footlights, is only to make an impression of provincial dilettantism. The effort to reason out a new style by the method of deduction from the nature of the proletariat, from the proletariat's collectivism, activism, atheism, and so forth, is the purest idealism. One must have a little historic vision. To understand that between our present-day economic and cultural poverty and the time of the fusion of art with life, that is, between the time when life will reach such proportions that it will be entirely formed by art, more than one generation will have come and gone, end quote. Trotsky. In view of its pretensions, Trotsky continued, it was not surprising that the work of the futurists was often sloppy, childish, and vulgar. In a long analysis of the poetry of Mayakovsky, Trotsky attempted to demonstrate how the good and the bad in futurism were embodied in futurism's leading figure. Dissecting Mayakovsky's images and word formations, the structure of Mayakovsky's poems, and Mayakovsky's poems' content, Trotsky argued that this, quote, enormous talent combined genius with lapses of the worst mediocrity. Lacking an internal equilibrium and maturity, still very much the bohemian he was at the outset of his career, Mayakovsky had no, quote, sense of proportion, end quote, no, quote, capacity for self-criticism, end quote, no, quote, sense of the measure, end quote, of art. This dynamic personality failed to create dynamism in Mayakovsky's poetry because Mayakovsky was also shouting at high pitch. Every image, phrase, stanza was a climax, and the reader was given no sense of development, a sense without which literary dynamics were impossible. The uncontrolled enthusiasm and excitement of the poet issued in imprecise and even absurdly false images. In the end, one was left with a highly individualistic poetry, which fell far short of doing what it had set out to do, namely arouse social passions. It spoke of the revolt of the poet, but not of society. Mayakovsky, Trotsky concluded, was still young, and one could hope that in the course of time Mayakovsky would outgrow his immaturity and lack of discipline. As for futurism in general, it had to reject the, quote, pretension that it represented the, quote, art of the proletariat. The maximal task it should set itself is to be a bridge and a link between the creative intelligentsia and the people, at a time when a wide, quote, when a quote wide chasm, end quote, still separated the creative intelligentsia and the people. Whatever one may think of its literary opinions, Literature and Revolution is one of Trotsky's most fascinating works. True, Literature and Revolution is written in a characteristically opinionated, almost arrogant tone. Literature and Revolution's criticisms are sometimes based on an unfair summing up of the views of the writers and movements discussed. The language is always scathing, sometimes mocking, and not infrequently rhetorical, and the professional critic will find much in it that is both imprecise and simplified, whether it be the terminology used or the analyses made of poetic and literary concept. But Literature and Revolution's intelligence is undeniable, as is Literature and Revolution's knowledge of works of literature and of the artistic, not just political issues these works raise. A genuine curiosity about literature runs throughout Literature and Revolution, and a sensitivity to the world of letters and imagination. Literature and Revolution is itself written in a colorful, flowing style, full of images, aphorisms, vivid allusions. There is hardly a trace of dilettantism in Literature and Revolution, and Trotsky has obviously read and digested all the works of fiction, poetry, and criticism which he discussed. Footnote: the summary of the book presented in the previous pages has not been exhaustive. Trotsky wrote also about such other trends or groups in Russian literature as the Imagists, the quote, Serapian fraternity, and the quote, Changing Landmarks group. See also Trotsky's observations on comedy and tragedy in the theater, and in architecture and sculpture. End footnote. Trotsky is a Marxist and leaves no doubt about it, and the consequence is that not a few arguments are predictably tendentious and certainly derived from many ideological preconceptions. But Trotsky makes no pretension to detachment, and, above all, eschews all narrow-mindedness. Trotsky's Marxism does not lead Trotsky into instant mechanical judgments, and it does not prevent Trotsky from appreciating politically inimical works. Though Trotsky knows what he likes, he does not allow this to limit his range of reading. Finally, while adamantly insisting that literature is a part of social life and subject to all social life's ups and downs, Trotsky fully recognizes that literature also unfolds in accordance with its own inner momentum and its own ways and powers of grasping and influencing the world. Quote, a work of art, Trotsky writes, quote, should in the first place be judged by the work of art's own law, that is, by the law of art, end quote. Trotsky. Literature and Revolution. And elsewhere, quote, artistic creation is also a deflection, a changing and a transformation of reality in accordance with the peculiar laws of art, end quote. Trotsky. Compare this with a definition Mayakovsky once gave of the relation between art and reality. Quote, art is not a copy of nature, but the determination to distort nature in accordance with its reflections in the individual consciousness, end quote. Mayakovsky. End footnote. Trotsky never again wrote so intensely or so sweepingly about literature. During the later 1920s, Trotsky reiterated on a number of occasions Trotsky's opposition to the idea of a quote, proletarian literature, end quote. But Trotsky made no further attempt to survey the state of Russian letters and hardly any to analyze the work of particular Russian writers. Footnote, particularly in the speech referred to in Chapter 7 of May 1924, the speech was delivered during a conference on party policy in the field of imaginative literature. An account of this conference is given by Carr, Socialism in One Country, 1, pages 91 to 95. 1 second. Back to the text. One observation in this speech is particularly illuminating, attacking those who saw in the works of Dante, Shakespeare, Byron, Goethe, and Pushkin merely historical documents describing the state of mind of particular class societies. Trotsky counterposed the concept of art as transcending its time and milieu. In this lay the genius of these writers, and Trotsky continued, the pleasure which was derived from reading their works was beyond history or classes. It was an artistic pleasure, a, quote, artistic delight. The speech was punctuated by interruptions and outcries from the proponents of a, quote, proletarian culture, with Trotsky replying in kind. It may be seen without exaggeration as a confrontation between an enlightened defender of literature and literature's worst Philistine enemies. End footnote. Footnote. A notable exception to this is an article of 1926 on Essenen, written following the latter's suicide. This is a gentle, almost tender tribute to Essenen's lyricism, expressing pain at the loss of a, quote, fine poet, so genuine and of so lovely a freshness, end quote. Here, too, however, Trotsky repeated a recurrent theme in Trotsky's literary writings of the 1920s that for most writers reared in pre-1917 Russia, the opening of a new era was a traumatically disorienting experience, uprooted and alienated from the past. They were yet so influenced by the past that they could not sink roots in the new present. As he had written about Bloch, who after, quote, the 12, produced almost nothing, so in the case of Essenen, Trotsky believed that a time of revolution, with its disharmony, violence, and suffering, led in one way or another to the silencing of the poet. Trotsky concluded his essay on Essenen with the words, quote, the poet is dead, long live poetry, end quote. See also earlier remarks on Essenen in Literature and Revolution. End footnote. In the 1930s, Trotsky's interest in literature revived, but this time it turned to European writing, particularly the French novel, and occasionally Trotsky would make jottings in his diary or write brief essays about the fiction he was reading. These are tiny vignettes which add little to our knowledge of Trotsky's literary views in general, but they are interesting for the light they throw in Trotsky's appreciation of non-Russian literature. Footnote. See, about Russian literature, Trotsky also wrote almost nothing in the 1930s as well, apart from a brief commentary on Alexei Tolstoy and one or two lesser-known contemporary Russian authors, and general observations on the decline of art and literature under Stalin. See the first section of this chapter. Trotsky's only excursion into Russian letters during this period was a brief evaluation of Maxim Gorky, written in 1936, following Gorky's death. Trotsky praised Gorky's humanism and the spontaneity and authenticity of Gorky's early writings, but regretted his later decline into, quote, didacticism. Trotsky's verdict on Gorky's stature as a writer was that Gorky was a, quote, great literary talent, not touched, however, by the breath of genius, end quote. End footnote. As was Trotsky's habit when reading Russian works, so in the novels of European writers, Trotsky sought a reflection of social reality. This time, of course, European reality. This is perhaps one reason why Trotsky was so fond of the French novel. Footnote. Trotsky's interest in French literature was of long standing. In a 1939 article, Trotsky wrote that he began reading French classics while in prison after 1905, and that Trotsky's taste for French novels never subsided during the 3 decades or so. Even during the Civil War, Trotsky noted, he had a current French novel in the car of his military train, and after being banished in 1929 to Turkey, Trotsky accumulated a private library of contemporary French fiction, which, however, was destroyed in 1931 in a fire. Trotsky's first Trotsky first commented on French literature in an introduction he wrote to a Russian edition of Marcel Martinet's play La Nuit, published in French under the title Le Drame du Prolétariat Français in Trotsky's Literature and Revolution, French edition. End footnote. He was particularly impressed by Louis-Ferdinand Céline's Voyage au bout de la nuit. Footnote. See Trotsky's essay Céline and Poincaré, Novelist and Politician, originally published in Atlantic Monthly, October 1935, and republished in Irving Howe's edited volume, The Basic Writings of Trotsky, published in 1964. End footnote. Louis-Ferdinand Céline lived from 1894 to 1961 and was a French novelist, polemicist, and physician. Céline's first novel, Journey to the End of the Night, published in 1932, won the Prix Renaudot, but divided critics due to the author's pessimistic depiction of the human condition and his writing style based on working-class speech. In subsequent novels such as Death on the Installment Plan, published in 1936, and Guignol's Band, 1944, and Castle to Castle, 1957, Céline further developed an innovative and distinct literary style. Maurice Nadeau wrote, quote, "What Joyce did for the English language, ... what the Surrealists attempted to do for the French language, Céline achieved effortlessly and on a vast scale," end quote. From 1937, Céline wrote a series of anti-Semitic polemical works in which Céline advocated a military alliance with Nazi Germany. Céline continued to publicly espouse anti-Semitic views during the German occupation of France and after the Allied landing in Normandy in 1944. Céline fled to Germany and then Denmark, where Céline lived in exile. Céline was convicted of collaboration by a French court in 1951, but was pardoned by a military tribunal soon after. Céline returned to France, where he resumed his career as a doctor and author. Céline is widely considered to be one of the greatest French novelists of the 20th century, and Céline's novels have had an enduring influence on later authors. However, Céline remains a controversial figure in France due to his anti-Semitism and activities during the Second World War. And the thing that I said earlier, Voyage au bout de la nuit, Journey to the End of the Night, is the first novel by Louis-Ferdinand Céline. Journey to the End of the Night is a semi-autobiographical work following the adventures of Ferdinand Barthélemy in World War I, colonial Africa, the United States, and the poor suburbs of Paris, where Ferdinand Barthélemy works as a doctor. Journey to the End of the Night won the Prix Renaudot in 1932, but divided critics due to the author's pessimistic depiction of the human condition and Céline's innovative writing style based on working-class speech, slang, and neologisms. It is now widely considered to be one of the greatest novels of the 20th century. Back to the text. Aside from expressing praise for Journey to the End of the Night's purely literary qualities, quote, the artist has newly threshed the dictionary of French literature, end quote. Trotsky was full of admiration for the manner in which, in his view, Céline had stripped the glossy veneer off French bourgeois society, exposing French bourgeois society's lies, falsehoods, and ugliness. Footnote, in order to emphasize the reality which he believed Céline wanted to expose, Trotsky devoted part of the essay to painting a scathing portrait of Poincaré, quote, the purest dilettante of bourgeois culture, end quote. Céline, who had, quote, walked into great literature as other men walk into their own homes, end quote, had written a novel full of pessimism, fright, and despair. In this, Trotsky believed lay the source of Journey to the End of the Night's greatness. But, as well, of Journey to the End of the Night's limitations. The artist was able to tell the truth about French society by descending psychologically into French society's lower depths. Céline was unable to transcend it, to even emerge from it, because instead of anger and indignation, he felt only weariness and desolation. Rejecting all conventions, literary and moral, Céline failed to find his way to, quote, light's glimmer, and ended in hopelessness. Céline, Trotsky concluded, quote, will not write a second book with such an aversion for the lie and such a disbelief in the truth. The dissonance must resolve itself. Either the artist will make his peace with the darkness, or the artist will perceive the dawn, end quote. Trotsky. Footnote. Céline, of course, eventually became a supporter of fascism. End footnote. End footnote. Another French novelist whom Trotsky respected, though not without reservations, was André Malraux. One second.
André Malraux.
Malraux.
André Malraux.
André Malraux. According to Wikipedia, André Malraux lived from 1901 to 1976, was a French novelist, art theorist, and minister of cultural affairs. Malraux's novel La Condition Humaine, Man's Fate, won the Prix Goncourt. André Malraux was appointed by President Charles de Gaulle as Information Minister, 1945 to 46, and subsequently as France's first Cultural Affairs Minister during de Gaulle's presidency between 1959 and 1969. And Wikipedia says, Man's Fate, La Condition Humaine, is a 1933 novel written by André Malraux about the failed communist insurrection in Shanghai in 1927 and the existential quandaries facing a diverse group of people associated with the revolution. Along with Les Conquérants, 1928, The Conquerors, and La Voie Royale, The Royal Way, Man's Fate forms a trilogy on revolution in Asia. Man's Fate was translated into English twice, both translations appearing in 1934, one by Hakon Chevalier and under the title Man's Fate, published by Harrison Smith and Robert Haas in New York, and republished by Random House as part of their modern library from 1936 on, and the other by Alastair MacDonald under the title Storm in Shanghai, published by Methuen in London and republished still by Methuen in 1948 as Man's Estate, to become a Penguin Pocket in 1961. Currently, the Chevalier translation is the one still in regular print. In 1958, Hannah Arendt published The Human Condition, one of Arendt's central theoretical works, whose English name is identical to the French title of Malraux's book. To avoid confusion, Arendt's book was translated in French first as Condition de l'homme moderne, the condition of modern man, and then as La humaine condition. Back to the text. After reading La Condition Humaine, Trotsky wrote to a New York publisher recommending that an American edition be brought out of La Condition, Man's Fate, quote, which is free from philosophical didacticism and remains from the beginning to end a true work of art. Footnote, quoted in Deutscher, The Prophet Outcast. Deutscher's source is a 1933 letter to Simon & Schuster in the closed section of Trotsky's archives. End footnote. Trotsky was much less enthusiastic about Malraux's earlier novel, Les Conquérants, dealing with Chinese events of 1924 to 27. The description for Malraux's The Conquerors says, The Conquerors describes the struggle between the Kuomintang and the Communists in the Cantonese Revolution of the 1920s. The Conquerors is both an exciting war story and a gallery of intellectual portraits, a ruthless Bolshevik revolutionary, a disillusioned master of propaganda, a powerful Chinese pacifist, and a young anarchist. Each of these, quote, conquerors will be crushed by the revolution they try to control. Back to the text. Although granted that it was a, quote, work written with talent, end quote, Trotsky could not help but be disappointed at the fact that Malraux had in effect defended Stalin's policy in China without even realizing that this policy had actually, quote, strangled the Chinese Revolution. Borodin, the emissary of the Comintern, was presented in the novel as a, quote, professional revolutionary, whereas Trotsky claimed Borodin was merely a bureaucratic, quote, functionary carrying out orders from his employers. Mikhail Borodin was a Bolshevik revolutionary and communist international agent. Mikhail Borodin was an advisor to Sun Yat-sen and the Kuomintang in China during the 1920s. Born in a rural part of the Russian Empire, now Belarus, to a Jewish family, Borodin joined the General Jewish Labor Bund at age 16 and then the Bolsheviks in 1903. After being arrested for participating in revolutionary activities, Borodin fled to America, attended Valparaiso University, started a family, and later established an English school for Russian Jewish immigrants in Chicago. Upon the success of the October Revolution in 1917, Borodin returned to Russia and served in various capacities in the new Soviet government. From 1919, Borodin served as an agent of the Comintern, traveling to various countries to spread the Bolshevik revolutionary cause. In 1923, Vladimir Lenin picked Borodin to lead a Comintern mission to China, where Borodin was tasked with aiding Sun Yat-sen and Sun Yat-sen's Kuomintang. Following Sun's death, Borodin assisted in the planning of the Northern Expedition and later became an integral backer of the KMT leftist government in Wuhan. Following a purge of communists from the Kuomintang, Borodin was forced to return to the Soviet Union in 1927, where Borodin would remain for the rest of his life. Borodin once again served in various positions within the Soviet government and later helped found the English-language Moscow newspaper, of which Borodin would become the editor-in-chief. During the Second World War, Borodin additionally served as editor-in-chief of the Soviet Information Bureau. Amidst rising anti-Semitism in the Soviet Union during the late 1940s, Borodin was arrested and deported to a prison camp. Borodin died in 1951 and was officially rehabilitated in 1964. Back to the text. The Chinese masses were treated by Malraux as a certain, quote, with a certain, quote, blasé superiority, end quote. These elements, according to Trotsky, gave the impression that Malraux was more fascinated by the manipulatory possibilities of revolutionary times and by power seekers than by the social significance itself of revolution. And this, Trotsky believed, had a deleterious effect on the literary merits of the conquerors, since the main characters, having been distorted, did not ring true, and the real issues involved in China, having been sidestepped, were deprived of their full poignancy. Footnote: Malraux, who was at that time an admirer of Trotsky, replied to Trotsky's criticisms of the conquerors. Trotsky then wrote a rejoinder in which he repeated in even harsher terms his original strictures. In August 1933, Malraux visited Trotsky during the latter's stay in France, and the two held a wide-ranging conversation described by Malraux in his, quote, Leon Trotsky, originally published in English in The Modern Monthly, March 1935, and republished in Trotsky Writings 1933 to 1934. End footnote. Trotsky's reading was not confined entirely to French fiction. He read Ignacio Silon's Fantamura and wrote an exceptionally laudatory notice about it. And in 1937, he wrote a letter to Jack London's daughter praising her father's novel, The Iron Heel. Which Trotsky had only then read for the first time. Trotsky was particularly impressed by The Iron Heel's gloomy, though, quote, prophetic vision of a Europe devastated by a new tyranny. Footnote: the letter was published in the New International April 1945. London's first novel appeared in 1907 and described the disaster which would ensue if socialism were to be defeated in Europe. Trotsky noted that fascism had confirmed London's worst fears. End footnote. On the whole, however, Trotsky retained throughout a preference for the French novel. Footnote: at one time, Trotsky attempted to read a novel by Edgar Wallace, which led Trotsky to express amazement at the fact that this, quote, mediocre, contemptible, and crude, end quote, author was so popular. As if unaware that English literature had produced works somewhat greater than those of Edgar Wallace, Trotsky added, quote, By this book alone you can judge to what a degree enlightened England ... remains a country of cultivated savages." End quote. Trotsky, Diary in Exile. End footnote. Perhaps the last of his literary pieces was an enthusiastic review of the novel Les Javanais by Jean Malachy. I don't know how to say that.
Jean Malachy.
Jean Malachy. In it, he expressed admiration not only for the particular work, but for French literature in general, declaring the technique of the French novel to be the highest in the world. Footnote. Written in 1939, the review was first published under the title A New Great Writer, Malachy, in the Fourth International, January 1941. Malachy's novel, which received the Goncourt Prize, was translated into English as Men from Nowhere. It dealt with the spiritual plight of certain Europeans torn out of their native soil and tradition and thrown together by their mutual fate. End footnote. Whatever the truth of this, it seems clear that it was the refinement of language combined with the realistic or naturalistic treatment of subject matter which attracted Trotsky to French as to other literature. One second. Wikipedia says, one second actually. Wikipedia says Ignacio Silone lived from 1900 to 1978. Ignacio Silone was an Italian politician, novelist, essayist, playwright, and short story writer, world famous during World War II for Ignacio Silone's powerful anti-fascist novels. Considered among the most well-known and read Italian intellectuals in Europe and the world, Ignacio Silone's most famous novel, Fontamara, became emblematic for Fontamara's denunciation of the condition of poverty, injustice, and social oppression of the lower classes has been translated into numerous languages. From 1946 to 1963, he was nominated for the Nobel Prize in Literature. For many years in anti-fascist exile abroad, Silone participated actively in various phases of Italian politics, animating the cultural life of Italy in the post-war period. Ignacio Silone was among the founders of Italy's Communist Party in 1921. Ignacio Silone was later expelled for his dissidence with the Stalinist party line and moved to democratic socialist positions. The break with the Italian Communist Party in the years after World War II led Ignacio Silone to be often opposed by Italian critics and rehabilitated belatedly despite a controversy about his relations with the Italian fascist secret police, while for all his career he was particularly appreciated abroad. And Fontamara by Ignacio Silone was written in 1933 when Ignacio Silone was a refugee from fascist Italy in Switzerland. Fontamara is Ignacio Silone's first novel, and Fontamara is regarded as Ignacio Silone's most famous work. Fontamara received worldwide acclaim and sold more than 1.5 million copies in 27 languages. Fontamara was first published in German translation in Switzerland in 1933. English translation was published by Penguin Books in September 1934. In 1980, Fontamara was adapted by Carlo Guizzani into an eponymous film. Appearing on the eve of the Spanish Civil War and published just a few months after Adolf Hitler came to power, when the world was beginning to take sides for or against fascism, the novel had a galvanizing effect on public opinion. Fontamara became, quote, the very symbol of resistance, end quote, and is, quote, widely agreed to have played a major role as a document of anti-fascist propaganda outside Italy in the late 1930s, as it criticizes the immorality and deceit of the fascist party and the fascist party's followers. Fontamara is a fictional village in Marsica in Abruzzo region. Its name is derived from the Italian fonte amara, bitter stream. The people, the Fontamaresi, are poor, and the village is so remote that the Fontamaresi are unaware of major social upheavals such as the rise of fascism. There is a tremendous gap between the Cofoni, peasants, who populate Fontamara, and those who live in the city. The Fontamaresi work the earth to survive, turn to emigration as a means of economic improvement, and are isolated, ignorant of events happening outside of the region and untouched by modernity and new technology. The impresario, in stark contrast to the Fontamaresi, who have labored for centuries to little avail, has quickly become the richest man in the region and embodies the power, authority, and immorality of the fascists. The Fontamaresi are exploited due to their naivety and ignorance. The women are raped by the black shirts. Berardo Viola makes the ultimate sacrifice to allow the continued distribution of clandestine texts that spread the word about socialism and encourage rebellion against fascism. At the end, the majority of the population are killed at the hands of the government. As with many rural novels, Fontamara discusses the various seasons and seasonal duties, such as the grape harvest in the vineyards. Fontamara is a choral novel that focuses on the lives and points of view of the peasants of Fontamara, deprived of hope yet persistent and determined. It depicts solidarity amongst the peasants and the inequality of wealth between the agricultural workers and the professional classes in the city. So, it's Fontamara. Wikipedia says The Iron Heel by Jack London is in the form of science fiction was first published in 1908. Oh, I'd like to have a little more information than that. Come on. Let's see. Goodreads says, generally considered to be, quote, the earliest of the modern dystopian, end quote. The Iron Heel chronicles the rise of an oligarchic tyranny in the United States. It is arguably the novel in which Jack London's socialist views are most explicitly on display. London presents a fictional, quote, Everhard manuscript hidden and found centuries in the future. The Iron Heel is a platform for him to espouse his socialist views and predict the collapse of capitalism. Very different from his other action novels, The Iron Heel envisions a future oligarchic tyranny in America and the rise of the Socialist Party. The Iron Heel has been credited with influencing George Orwell's 1984. Jean Malachi lived from 1908 to 1998. Jean Malachi was a French novelist. Jean Malachi was born as Vladimir Jan Pavel Maleski in Warsaw in 1908 of a non-religious Polish family of Jewish descent. In 1926, Jean Malachi left Poland, traveling in Eastern Europe and the Middle East. Malachi wrote, "I had the feeling that the end of the world was approaching in Poland, so I wanted to discover the life of other lands before it disappeared entirely. Morally and intellectually, I was a tramp, a companion of the dispossessed," end quote. Malachi. Malachi settled in France, where Malachi worked as a laborer and adopted the name of Jean Malachi, which he took from Kwai Malachi. Jean Malachi was associated with, though not formally a member of, several French leftist organizations, including the Trotskyist Communist League, and during the Spanish Civil War, Malachi joined the Republican forces as a member of the militia columns of the Left Workers' Party of Marxist Unification. Malachi obtained the Prix Renaudot in 1939 for his novel Les Javanais, based on his experience as an immigrant mine worker in Provence. It was admired by André Gide, who made Malachi his private secretary. At the beginning of World War II, Jean Malachi was conscripted in the French army, though not a French citizen. Jean Malachi was captured by the Wehrmacht, but managed to escape and fled to southern France. In 1943, he succeeded in leaving France with the assistance of Varian Fry and the Emergency Rescue Committee bound for Mexico, and eventually the United States, where Malachi became a naturalized citizen. His parents died in Nazi Germany concentration camps. Jean Malachi returned to France in 1947, but left again for the United States in 1948. Beginning in 1942 and continuing after the war, he was a member of the left communist group Gauche Communiste de France in the United States. Jean Malachi was loosely affiliated with several non-communist left groups. Jean Malachi's most famous work about an international group of exiles in Vichy, France, was Planète sans visa, 1947, which has been translated into many languages. One second. Not really seeing anything. Yeah, I'm not really seeing anything for Le Javanais, the men from Java. So, back to the text. There seems no point in pretending that Trotsky's literary criticism was governed by purely artistic interests, and it is perhaps too much to expect from so political an animal that Trotsky should judge literature by purely literary criteria. Trotsky was quite clearly interested above all in the social side of literature, and this affected his attitude towards individual works. As a Marxist, Trotsky had quite definite views about the place and significance of art. Sometimes this very nearly led Trotsky to judge a work according to whether that work served social and political, quote, progress. Trotsky's preference for, quote, realism, end quote, was no doubt initially a matter of personal taste, but it was certainly reinforced by Marxism. And, in any case, Trotsky could never agree that literature or art in general was an independent domain, a world unto itself, something which existed for its own sake only. Nevertheless, Trotsky belongs to that small number of Marxist critics whose observations on literature are both enlightened and enlightening. Though writing from a Marxist point of view, Trotsky's judgments were not vulgar. The economic, quote, substructure was not made to emerge and peer out at every turn, and the, quote, class struggle was not perceived to be bursted out of every poem or novel. Though partial to, quote, realism, Trotsky was not narrow-minded. Trotsky recognized that literature would not be literature were it merely to photograph reality, and that creativity consisted of facility with language, and of the talent for evoking worlds and experiences which were of a different reality, one residing in the imagination and therefore transcending and enlarging the horizons of the material world. As for the use to which literature could be put, Trotsky was certainly not averse to mobilizing literature for revolutionary goals, but Trotsky was totally opposed to turning literature into propaganda, whether as, quote, proletarian literature or as a, quote, department of government. Quote, the actual development of art, end quote, Trotsky wrote in 1923, quote, and art's struggle for new forms are not part of the party's tasks, nor are they its concern, end quote. Footnote, Trotsky, Literature and Revolution. Trotsky's opposition to the interference of politics in art was also discussed in Chapter 7, end footnote. This was not merely the paying of lip service to the freedom of art. It was written when Trotsky was still a powerful political figure and taking an active leading part in party discussions against the first attempts to circumscribe the style and content of literature. Whatever one may predict for his policies in other areas, Trotsky remained in power. Had Trotsky remained in power, it seems hardly imaginable that in the field of literature, Trotsky would have decreed the dictatorship of the dictatorship of the party, or the, quote, proletariat, end quote. The fact that Trotsky saw art and literature as an in themselves revolutionary by nature, seeking forever to break out of the constraints of past literary traditions and conventions, did not prevent Trotsky from perceiving the ambiguous impact of social revolution upon creative work. On the one hand, radical social and political change could liberate the artist in a way that the artist himself, depending upon his own powers only, could never do. On the other hand, no artist was or could be entirely free of the roots of his past, and an artist working at a time of revolution was no less, perhaps more, a victim of the shock of disorientation created by such a time than other men. Perhaps Trotsky's most valuable contribution in the field of literary criticism was this understanding of the unsettled nature of art in unsettled times. In Trotsky's analyses of the work of Russian writers in the years following 1917, Trotsky continually emphasized what Trotsky took to be the almost schizophrenic state of mind which characterized their work. Psychologically rooted in the past, ideologically striving to reach out to the present and future. For these writers, Trotsky believed, adjustment could never be complete, and it was fundamentally wrong. In his view, to impose it upon them, just as it was fundamentally wrong to assume that the goals of a revolution were a sufficient guide to the role and character of art. Perhaps this sensitivity to the impact of revolution on creative pursuits was the reason why Trotsky maintained in the end that the crisis in post-revolutionary art must be confronted and resolved by art itself, and that the forms art takes in the future were a matter of the future itself, and not for the preconceptions of the present. Footnote. In Trotsky's Diary in Exile, Trotsky noted, quote, art is always carried in the baggage train of a new epoch, and great art, is an especially heavy load. There has been no great new art in the Soviet Union so far is quite natural and, should not and cannot alarm anyone. What can be alarming, though, are the revolting imitations of a new art written on the order of the bureaucracy, The first condition for artistic creativity is sincerity. An old engineer can perhaps build a turbine reluctantly, but one cannot write a poem reluctantly. End quote. Trotsky. End footnote. And that's the end of this section. Thank you so much for listening.